My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute in Budapest, and I'd like to welcome you to our Buddha Hills podcast.
Eric Hendriks and I are recording this conversation in a historic villa that overlooks the Danube from one of the Buddha Hills. Our guest today is Professor David Martin Jones, who obtained his doctorate from the London School of Economics and went on to teach at the National University of Singapore in the late 1980s and heady early 1990s. He then taught at the University of Tasmania, University of Queensland in Australia, and most recently at the War Studies Department at King's College London. He's currently Director of Research here at the Danube Institute in Budapest. Professor Jones has written for many publications, including The Spectator, The Times in London, and is the author of numerous books. I'll only mention here his major geopolitical opus, History's Fools, out now with Hurst in London, and his 2001 study, The Image of China in Western Social and Political Thought. So today, Eric and I are very keen to hear from him on his 2022 book, The Strategy of Maoism in the West, Rage and the Radical Left, which he co-authored with Professor M.L.R. Smith, also of King's College London. David, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
So I would like to begin with just a very broad question. It seems to me, having read the book, that one of the main claims, and I can actually quote here the final line in the book, is that China's most enduring export is something that we could call both cultural revolution and some idea of permanent revolution. Do you think that's a correct analysis?
Yeah, well, it was the selling kind of strapline, for the idea of the book, which came out of an article Mike and I initially wrote for an online publication in the UK, which gathered some attention. And the line just came to me that given that we're always talking about China's export model and its growth model, and its becoming the world's second leading economy and likely to become the world's leading economy in the next decade or so, that its most enduring export actually was before the economic reform era. It was under Mao, and it was the export of the doctrine of cultural revolution. And this was a very distinctive model of cultural revolution that Mao pioneered, and which gained huge popularity in France initially, but also across the West. And, of course, in the non-Western world, in what was then the Third World or developing world, where Mao's ideas translated to South American revolutionaries, African revolutionaries, and Middle Eastern revolutionaries. So it was a really very powerful model of revolution, to which I don't think we give sufficient attention, especially in its implications now for the wokest psychodrama that we're experiencing in France, the UK, and the US at the moment.
So your book takes us from the Yan'an caves in China, from the early communist movement, Maoist movement in China, via the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, to Europe, to the United States, to the present. Now the lines going from the Cultural Revolution in China that started in 1966 to Europe are rather uncontroversial, although you provided a very interesting account. But they're uncontroversial because they're so obvious, they're so pronounced, they were so prominent. But then you stress, you and Smith stress the legacy that this has. And this is a less explored subject, and of course, a subject of enormous relevance. Now, one of the reasons Maoism could have such a legacy in the West, distinct from other forms of socialism and other forms of communism, is because it was quite distinct as an ideology. What distinguishes Maoism as an ideology from, let's say, Stalinism or Marxism, Leninism in general?
Well, I think obviously Mao's understanding of Marxism comes out of his admiration, particularly for Stalin. You know, the Stalinist model obviously deeply appealed to Mao, not so much necessarily, you know, Marxist dialectic, but the model of revolution that started with Stalin but evolved into the one-party state of the Soviet Union. And if you think about it, I mean, what becomes quite interesting is that the China's relationship with the Soviet Union and now with Russia is almost is fascinating, has been fascinating since you know, Stalin dominated the communist world after the 1940s. And after Stalin's death, one of the reasons China saw itself differently and, you know, saw itself as a socialism with Chinese characteristics was that the Stalinist model, as Mao saw it, had been abandoned by Khrushchev, and that the Soviet Union was now no longer the flagship of the revolution, the permanent revolutionary cause, but had abandoned this for a kind of soft authoritarianism, really. So I think there's two or maybe three aspects to the distinctiveness of Chinese version of Marxism that is Maoism. One was essentially to be pragmatic and revolutionary, that what Mao was concerned about, as also was Sun Yat-sen, his contemporary and a nationalist, both of them were concerned about the humiliation of China in a way that wasn't so obvious with the Soviet Union. I mean, they were anti the emperor, but they hadn't thought of Russia as a humiliated space as China did. And, you know, the classic statement of Mao when you know, he announces the triumph of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949 is that Zhongguo Zhu Lai, isn't it? Zhu Li?
Zhou Enlai?
No, China stood up. The phrase he utters in, you know, China has now stood up.
Maybe we can do what some podcasts do, where you do like the live looking up. Continue, yeah.
Yeah. So the idea that China has stood up meant that China is now back as a significant cultural state or a significant political state, and nationalism and the organization of China, the modernization of China, and the rise of China as a distinctive Chinese understanding of socialism, which is then exportable to the world, is something that gives this distinctive framework to Mao's thinking and to the promotion of Maoism.
Yes. Now, there was one really interesting phrase you used in the book. I think you quoted another author, but you mentioned that Stalin was obsessed with, or Hitler was obsessed with who he ruled over, What was their character? What was the ethnic character? Stalin was obsessed with what his subjects might do, and Mao was obsessed with what they thought.
Yes. And I think this element of, I think that's a very good point. I mean, what Mao was concerned about was not only the organization of China to make it stand up and be effective in global politics, but also how the people were themselves. That the idea, I mean, when the American journalist T.H. White, when Time sent him to Yunnan in 42 or 43 to interview Mao, to spend time in Yunnan, he says that he talks to a cadre that's come back from the field, and the cadres have to go through a process of re-education to get the latest line that is the mass line, but is really the party's line. And this process of endless interrogation, self-interrogation, and going back to a tradition, a classic Chinese tradition of rectification, becomes central to Mao's or to this Maoist self-understanding, and this idea of promoting this doctrine, to promoting processes of education and re-education in Mao thought, becomes, as Miles Yu has said, China calls it its own magic weapon, propaganda, and its propaganda institutes have always been seen as powerful promoters of an image of China, which has always found sympathetic interlocutors in the West ever since Edgar Snow went to the Yunnan caves in the late 30s, early 40s to write his hagiography of Mao, Red Star over China.
Well, so I'm a bit curious, just as we sort of look at what the Cultural Revolution was and where it came from, before we move on to kind of the reception you've just mentioned, the reception in the West. I was curious if you could talk a bit about, one of the words that stood out to me in reading the book is this expression neophilia. So like the love of the new, the obsession with the new. And this seems to be one way or another connected with the hostility to what was called at the time the Four Olds. So old ideas, old culture, old customs, and old habits all had to be annihilated and swept away. And I'm curious if you could just tell our listeners a bit about this very self-conscious, very systematic hostility to the old, and how they went about destroying it.
Yeah, I mean, without going too deep into Mao's, not to psychoanalyze Mao, but Mao obviously had a problem with both being, enabling China to stand up and being sort of horrified by Chinese weakness, that it had actually failed under its Confucian style of rule, which had lasted, over 2 millennium, but had shown itself as weak and, in a sense, failed when subject to Western treaties and unequal treaties dating from the Opium War in the 1840s down to, the response to the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 and the series of unequal treaties that had ripped and destroyed a dynastic cultural arrangement. So the whole of China, although he's a Chinese nationalist, the whole of Chinese culture had proved inadequate to the task of modernity. So in a sense, in order to create the new Chinese man, or woman, you had to eradicate the old and rely on engineering the soul, re-engineering the soul of the Chinese. So, from his earliest writings in the Yan'an caves, he stresses the idea of the poor and the blank peasant as the ideal, not the culture Jinzi of Confucian understanding or the Mandarin.
Is that the gentleman? Or?
Yeah,
Okay.
But so that gentlemanly cultural individual, which was central to Confucian self-understanding, was seen as the weakness for Mao. The strength was the peasantry, the enduring peasantry, and their poverty and blankness and stoicism was what the doctrine or Maoism could draw upon to redraw and re-engineer, to remake China, remold the individual and remold society and remold the state. So everything old had to be swept away so that the new era could begin, the utopia that Mao envisaged as China's future and potentially the world's.
So this idea that the hatred of the old is connected to the kind of losses suffered in the colonial period or the height of the imperialist period in the 19th century leads me to ask whether this is one of the most fundamental features of the Maoist model, and that is that it is more explicitly than the Soviet model. I mean, we could discuss this. There's a lot to discuss, but it's more self-consciously anti-colonial in its structure and in its motivation. Does that sound right to you?
Oh yeah, I think that's right. I think from its inception, the deep scar that was left on the Chinese psyche, not only for Maoists but also for nationalists, was the seeming humiliation of China in the 19th century. So, having gone from seeing itself as the center of the world, Zhongguo, and to be the center of culture, Wenhua, it had been humiliated. So everything that people had believed it stood for over 2 millennia had been, almost swept away in a 20-year period after 1842. So that deep sense that the Western powers were A, more powerful, and B, had humiliated China and colonized it, even though they hadn't actually colonized it. They'd opened, 5 or 6 treaty ports.
A few more than that.
Well,
there were quite some.
Okay, well, there was a few treaty ports, but mainly along the coast.
Yeah, and among some river areas. Yeah.
So you could say, the colonial experience wasn't colonization like India.
No, they call it semi-colonized status, which I think is a rather apt description.
Yes, we could agree on that, I think. But anyway, so there was a colonial experience in the way Russia never had that. So it wasn't important for the Soviets. It became more important then. Maoism, as a distinctive form of a nationalist response, which fits with other nationalist responses across the colonial world, then becomes, particularly potent at regenerating or, reinforcing anti-colonial movements generally globally. So Zhou Enlai is very significant in the attempt to build an alternative world order based on Bandung after 1954. That Zhou Enlai, Nehru, Sukarno all come together to forge what Sukarno called the Nephos, the new forces against Ophos, the old colonial world, to bring about the new world order, really, which would be an Asian world order, not a Western one. So, deeply permeating Mao's thinking is an anti-colonialism, which feeds into thinking in South America, Africa, and India.
So, we're all new to this. So I was looking up the phrase you used, and I think you were referring to. So I was rather slow in doing so, but I think you were referring to the first speech of Mao in 1949 at the first plenary session. Zhongguo Renmin, the Chinese people, Zhen Qilai has stood up.
Yeah, Zhen Qilai,
which is a memorable phrase that left a long echo into the present. Can I go to the confession aspect of Maoism, which played an important role in the Cultural Revolution and before that in the land reform, and maybe one of those places where we can identify potentially a longer legacy that stretches into the contemporary West. So we have the confession ritual called suku, struggle sessions, it's sometimes translated as in English, which were particularly important during the land reform, when villagers around China were grouped in 5 different classes by party work units, and so people were categorized based. So the worst class to be part of was the landlord class, and the best part was to be a poor farmer, a peasant. And so you have these 5 classes, and then after everyone was categorized and knew where they stood, they would come together on a frequent basis to enact this ritual, this classifying ritual, in which the landlords had to tell their life story and remember that they always oppressed the workers and the farmers, and the poor farmers had to recollect their life story and remember that they has always been oppressed by the landlords. And in some villages there were actually good relationships between landlords and villagers, so they had to. It needed some the villagers needed some persuadings that the landlords had always been evil. And of course, the classifications were rather arbitrary. Sometimes if your plot of land was a little bit bigger than someone else's plot of land, and you were grouped as a landlord, had you not bought an extra animal earlier that month, you would have been in the good category, but now you fell on the landlord side. So it was all rather arbitrary. And it made a return in the Cultural Revolution, but during the Cultural Revolution, of course, intellectuals and high party officials and teachers were targeted. And so at Peking University, where I used to work, they targeted teachers, and they forced them to confess their crimes. So it was a confessional ritual and a classificatory ritual. This is a very distinctive part of Maoism, and it seems to be an innovation, and one that may be part of its powerful legacy in the West. So how do you look at this?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I think that and the way you described it, puts it very well, how this constant sort of desire to keep people in a state of permanent anxiety, really, about their feelings and their appropriate responses to, mainly authority figures. So, and any authority figure could not be comfortable in their role, because they could always be asked to struggle against their behaviors. So, as you say, the Cultural Revolution is launched at Beidar by a junior lecturer who puts up a poster denouncing her, superiors for their bourgeois.
Although, interestingly enough, it took a long time before the students actually started committing violence. Yeah. So the students needed a lot of encouragement, actually for a few months before the first teacher was actually killed.
And that was encouraged by Mao.
Yes.
as well, directly almost.
And it took the daughter of a general to actually to actually kill a teacher before the mass violence started. Bin Bin, what's her family name? Ren Bin. I'm so bad this morning. I should have drank even more coffee.
We are recording a bit earlier than usual. It might be worth noting.
But it started. So the violence started at a girls' high school in Beijing, and the girls beat to death their headmasters, and Mao then got 1 million Red Guards onto Tiananmen Square, and the girl that had been in charge and was the daughter of this general was given the honor of being allowed to put a ribbon on Mao, which then signaled to everyone: violence is good. Attack your authority figures. And the authority figures in China were, of course, traditionally the teachers. So this is, if you want to invert authority in the Chinese tradition, you'll go for the teachers.
That's right. And I think that idea of criticism, permanent criticism, struggle sessions, is part of, T.H. White, who interestingly, as I've referred to earlier, was in Yunnan in the 40s for Time, talks when he's talking to a cadre who's been going through these struggle sessions about his approach to the revolution, his approach to the masses, and whether it's the correct line. He's struggling for a phrase to translate that into English, and what becomes the common term is brainwashing. That's the Americans use. But White says, through my translator, we arrived at the term consciousness raising. And he said, ironically, when I'm covering the student demonstrations against the Vietnam War in the late 60s, I find the term I invented for Time in 45 being used directly by students that were seeking to raise consciousness. So you can sort of take the line that, you're quite right, this preoccupation with the consciousness, the understanding of not only the elites, but the masses, and their permanent rectification is something that subsequently appealed very strongly to what people like David Horowitz, who was part of it in the 60s, calls the New Left.
The term that was translated as consciousness raising was Chifa Jewu, and the young lady, or I shouldn't say lady, the not so ladylike young woman who, teenager in fact, who murdered her headmistress was Song Bingbin. But this is all very fascinating. But there are many facets to it. Maybe we should turn to.
Well, I think I was going to ask a bit about the connection, which I'll make in just a moment. The connection between the compelled speech we've been discussing, this sort of confession culture, and the suppression of speech. And I think it's interesting that, in a sense, the disruption of academic culture is a form of it kind of links. So the students want to hear certain things, which links to the confession culture. But there's also, not only in China, but in Europe in the 1960s, there's this pattern of kind of disrupting the lecture situation, the seminar situation. I'm thinking both of the very famous photo of Adorno being interrupted by several young ladies right before he calls the Polizei. So the Frankfurt School gets the police on the line, which is kind of fun. But also, I've seen a video of Jacques Lacan at my university, the University of Louvain, in 1968, trying to give a seminar. and a number of students sort of disrupt the proceedings and so on and so forth. Okay, but I wanted to read, so we're coming from the kind of compelled speech of the confession culture by way of student protest, but I wanted to read a line from Mao, which seems to have some echoes today, and just ask for your thoughts on this. So you quote Mao as saying, as far as unmistakable counter-revolutionaries and saboteurs of the socialist cause are concerned, I think we're probably in the number. Yeah, that's right. The matter is easy. We simply deprive them of their freedom of speech. And to what extent do you think this suppression of speech is part of the Maoist legacy in the West?
Well, I think that there's obviously a line here around, but I mean, I think you could say that generally about totalitarian styles of thinking. You could find that in the Soviet Union as well. It's just that Mao was very clear that he was clear about two things. One, that in order to get people following the mass line, it was to keep them permanently insecure in a state of atomization, so that everyone could never feel exactly comfortable in their role, whether as a party cadre or as a poor and blank peasant. You could always be subject, you could always find yourself the subject of some kind of inquiry, which requires you to testify, to confess, to explain your behaviors down to minimal areas about, the way you might treat your cat or dog or your child in some, or your child might even denounce you, of course. So there's a Maoist concern with atomizing everybody so that you would be following whatever you thought was the correct mode of thinking. So it was easy, if you like, to suppress speech in these contexts because everybody would be terrified. Fear would be the animating principle of the rectification world, really. So everybody's anxious, everybody's insecure. So, suppressing ideas that you find controversial is relatively straightforward once you've created the culture of fear. But along with that, with the culture of fear, he's always very clear that liberalism is, he despises liberalism. Liberalism brought us, colonization in the first place. It was liberal thinkers, liberal free marketeers like John Stuart Mill that actually defended the Opium Wars. It was liberal traders, like from the East India Company that built up the China trade. So he despises liberal economics, but he particularly finds its weakness to allow alternative views, that the ability to allow different views, that its ability to tolerate is in fact its central weakness. And it's there we attack it. Liberals are weak because they tolerate. And if they tolerate, we can use that toleration against them to assert endlessly our own opinion, never to deviate from it, and to undermine it.
So even though it was the liberals who, in a sense, inflicted the century of humiliation, and I do think this is worth really stressing that it was often the most liberal and progressive elements who were the imperialists. But even though, in a sense, the liberal model, however much we may deplore it, was the one that kind of proved its efficacy in China in the 19th century, he saw liberalism as fundamentally weak. I mean, there's a certain paradox there, no?
Well, I think he recognized the power of the imperial model. He thought it was deeply hypocritical. He didn't think the liberals really believed it. But by liberalism allowing for different parties for a start under a liberal democratic regime, and for it tolerating freedom of the press and freedom of debate, which liberal pluralism thought was the only way you could organize a modern secular society. Mao saw it entirely differently. He saw liberal pluralism, its tolerance of difference, as allowing a powerful monolithic party to exploit that tolerance, to take the victim position, to undermine liberal sort of sensibility and its very tolerance, to, where the classic line was to expose the iron fist in the velvet glove, that this sort of liberal tolerance was concealing really its kind of military might. But once its military might was waning, its velvet glove was just a weak thing that you could cast away, and you would use the externally, you would exploit international organizations to explore the hypocrisies of liberalism, and internally you'd facilitate student movements across the West to undermine and take down the liberal regimes to bring about the new world order, which would be led by China, really. Because China is the biggest country on the globe and has the most population. So in simple democratic terms, it's the majority.
Perhaps the ultimate weakness then of liberalism, ironically, is that Maoism actually managed to move into the liberal world and even infiltrate the very thought that nowadays goes under the name liberalism.
That's right. That's right.
Because there's something really eerie going on in your book, where you, on the one hand, describe lines of influence that are implicit, impacting contemporary modes of political and social thought. And on the other hand, you're showing the mechanisms through which that influence is actually hidden. So pertaining to post-colonial literature, this is very interesting. So you argue that there are influences of Maoism on post-colonial literature, which is not so odd, because of course Mao was a great leader of the third world. That's how he styled himself. At the Bandung conference, where Zhou Enlai represented China, this message was brought forth, and the post-colonial scholars in the West were reaching out to the thought of and the agency of the third world. But a common trope in that post-colonial literature, especially associated with Spivak's essay, 1988 essay, The Subaltern Doesn't Speak, is the assumption that it's always been the West lording over its categories over the rest, which makes it harder, you argue, for us to actually perceive lines of influence going from other places in the world to the West. And you write in the introduction to the book, quote, after 1968, the New Left focused its attention on deconstructing the West's democratic and economic practices and legacies. It became increasingly impossible to articulate, let alone study, how the West itself might have had its language of political self-understanding corrupted by ideas of a non-Western provenance. The disposition itself reflected an evolving Maoist influence upon the study of non-Western culture. This is rather eerie. So it's the very impact of Maoism, the very influence of Maoism, may be exactly why we're not able to perceive its legacy.
Yeah, I think that's, the argument, as you know, it's always assumed, particularly at the end of after the end of history, after the Fukuyama moment, you read whether it's Fukuyama or...
Although Fukuyama's still out there spreading the good word.
Well,
But anyway.
well, I don't know what word he's spreading at all at the moment. He seems to, change his mind every few minutes, depending on the state of the Ukraine.
Exactly.
In his defense, he's rather consistent in the sense that he always changes. He has the same message, but he always consistently brings it out when it's convenient. Yeah. So after the just as a little side note, when the American military left Afghanistan in a rather disorderly state, he was writing essays. Fukuyama was writing essays in The Economist, announcing the rise of a multipolar world order and the demise of the West. And then when Russia invaded the Ukraine just a few months later, and it didn't seem to be going well for Russia, he was again lashing out with the old end of history notion.
Yeah, well, this is the problem of some aspects of Fukuyamaism and the idea that you're never wrong, really, because you're non-falsifiable at some level. But if we take the general trajectory of Western thinking from what Quentin Skinner called the return of grand theory from about the late 1980s onwards, the grand theories were either deconstructive, Foucault, or they were powerfully re-endorsing, modernization theory, which is what Fukuyama and then, sort of people like Thomas Friedman, who takes it to the, nth degree in The Lexus and the Olive Tree in 1990. Not 2000.
Takes it to the parodic degree.
Takes it to the, the zenith of, kind of, the idea of the golden straitjacket, that you embrace the market. Once you embrace the market, you get the middle classes. Once you get the middle classes, you get a forceful movement towards liberalism and democracy, and the whole world is on this highway, which is at the end of Fukuyama's book-length version of his rather slim essay, which first appeared in the National Interest in 1989. It ends up with this, kind of another, cliched metaphor, the wagon train. It's America, so the wagon train, sets off from the West, of course, and it, the wagon train is heading towards the happy land of polyarchy on the West Coast, and eventually all the Western wagons set off first, but the later developing Asian wagons and African ones are following on. Some of them might be, hijacked by the odd Indian tribe. Others might get lost in the desert for a bit.
But wait a second.
There are so many problems with this, with this picture.
But now we're really looking at the liberal version.
There's
a more liberal, within quotation marks, version of this, a more post-colonial leftist influenced version.
But I think it's in that context of this liberal worldview that there's the assumption that, the whole world is moving in this direction. We're not noticing that actually within the West, the West is so kind of hubristic in its assumption that the West visits itself upon the world. The world is going along a trajectory, a teleology. It's following a teleological path. Therefore, these elements that are saying actually the West is, duplicitous, colonialist, not this democratic. Just, kind of neo-Rawlsian laws of peoples that is evolving within it is a hideous, kind of colonialism. The West, and this can be just deconstructed and exposed. This is sort of ignored by the progressive tendency because you take it on board. You take it on board as legitimate criticism coming from, and you have to say, oh yes, that's a very good point. We have made these errors. We should compensate. We should build bigger institutions that accommodate difference, etc., neglecting the fact that a lot of the ideas that were then emerging to shape what becomes a kind of woke ideology were already in place in the universities that actually despised the liberal project from the outside, but used its resources for its own, post-colonial ends. So there's something deeply, it's quite interesting reading, the key theorists of this who are non-Western Westerners, Edward Said and Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, who's, like Spivak's, kind of major claim to fame is to translate Derrida's of grammatology, and of grammatology, when you read it, is one of Derrida's more accessible works, badly translated from the French by Spivak, with a longer introduction by Spivak than the book itself, And Spivak's reputation is formed on this, exposure of the différance and the différende, and to say that, Derrida is sympathetic to the non-Western world, but he is actually in the Western world and does not understand where the non-West comes from, that the subaltern has been, permanently talked about, referred to, diagnosed, and essentially emasculated by Western thought. And it's how we make the subaltern speak, because the subaltern has always been silenced. Interestingly, of course, the people who speak for the subaltern are people like Spivak and Said, who enjoy prestigious positions and grants at Columbia University.
It never takes the form of someone like Spivak actually transmitting non-Western ideologies, or either through anthropological research or through comparative political theory. Instead, it's a kind of empty presence in the discourse. There is this non-Western thought that we're supposed to respect, but it's not really the focus of post-colonial discourse in an odd way. It's still nowadays, if you read post-colonial criticisms of sociology, so I'm myself a sociologist, so I read a lot of these criticisms, there's this odd genre of critical text which says that, the Western sociology is way too focused on Western authors. We should be more focused on non-Western authors. And then you can go through page after page without any examples or any in-depth discussion of the kind of non-Western ideologies they would want sociologists to focus on. But then if you actually start looking at what kind of ideologies are out there, then everyone is suddenly, the post-colonial people are often not so interested, or ironically, in exploring those.
I think that's absolutely right. So the whole exercise is one to debunk any Western scholarship, of an Eastern other, whether it's a 19th century account by Raffles, or somebody like the former, sort of governor of Malaya, Frank Swetnam, who learnt Malay culture, could write in Malay script, formed the, Southeast Asian Society, regular journals, looking at Malay practices historically, does a history of Malaya. This is, the post-colonial idea is to say, Swetnam, he was, the fact that he was engaged with Malay culture was only to exploit it, to use it. So most post-colonial discourse theory is not about looking at, how Malay culture, how Swetnam got it wrong, maybe. It's to say that Swetnam comes from this perspective. He must therefore be a hideous colonialist. We'll cherry pick the work to show that we mustn't read Swetnam on the Malays, that he's an odious imperialist figure. He obviously exudes pleasure in the empire. This itself, kind of makes him a non-person. So, just to finish, so a lot of that post-colonial discourse is about rubbishing previous sociologies, histories, anthropologies, etc., but replacing it with nothing,
and obscuring actual lines of influence coming from, for instance, from Maoism.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes, exactly.
Well, coming back to Maoism in a moment, but could we almost say that Said's version of Orientalism is more Eurocentric in a certain way than the 19th century, the true scientific Orientalism of the 19th century universities and sort of the gentlemen scholars who were fascinated, endlessly fascinated and devoted to the East and to the South. And Said is totally obsessed with actually the European construction of these spaces.
Yeah, well, I mean, we know that, if we look at Said's intellectual biography, he's got an alleged connection to kind of Palestine, although his father is...
I would note Palestinian Christian, by the way. Member of the Church of England.
Yeah, well, his father was an American, he worked with the Americans closely in Egypt. He went to an elite Egyptian school, international school, where he learned to hate England, or English culture, even though he was reading English literature. He particularly detested I.A. Richards, who'd spent time in China, written on China at Columbia, and has his, kind of light bulb moment in Paris, where he's gone to, postgraduate work and meets with Foucault, stays at Foucault's apartment, and applies a sort of Foucauldian model to, in a very simplistic and based on literary works, not upon anything sociological, as Ernest Gellner pointed out, to develop this model of Orientalism. But as you rightly say, he completely cherry picks his kind of his works to show a West that is always, reducing the native to the little brown brother or other kind of stereotypes, ignoring the fact that actually the term Orientalism, as it emerged in the late 18th, early 19th century, was he completely ignores a work by another serious French student of the Orient, Raymond Schwab, who writes a definitive study that Said gives one reference to, but never refers to the argument, which is the La Renaissance Orientale, Schwab's big study, which shows that actually the way the 18th century literary gentlemen like William Jones, the Welsh judge of Bengal, translates the whole Hindi canon and tries to adjust Indian law to British common law. And in writing about Indian culture, as with other French and British, students of the Middle East and India and then of China, is to Jones argues that the Europe is a bit dull. It's got jaded with its kind of Romano Christian Judeo background, and particularly in the 18th century, its cult of Republican, Latin Roman authors, and it needs an infusion of Oriental ideas and understandings to give it a new resonance. And there's an actual cult of the Orient in the 18th century.
Of course, and there was during the Renaissance as well. I mean, Egyptian Hermeticism and Persian lore and so on and so forth. I mean, I'm actually reading a book at the moment which was gifted to me by my co-host, Eric Hendriks, The Idea of the West, Culture, Politics and History, by Alistair Bonnet, who I believe comes from a rather markedly different place politically. But the only point I want to make is that it complements your book in the sense that Bonnet tries to argue that the West is as much a construction of the East as the reverse. And the whole kind of Orientalist discourse of the last 50 years has really systematically and programmatically obscured this fact, which I think authors from both the left and the right, so-called, really need to push back against. That the West has been influenced by Eastern and Southern discourses for a very long time, and will continue to be.
Yeah, and in fact, if you looked at, I mean, the problem with the Said position, not so much with Spivak, but both of them are haunted by the idea that they, like Mao, that their cultures were colonized and ripped apart and hideously maltreated by this Western imperialist moment. But from Said's perspective, his whole focus is on the Middle East, where the Western Christian relationship with Islam was always pretty fraught and often problematic. The relationship with China was very different. I mean, the period of the unequal treaties was the most exploitative period. But if we went back to an earlier traditions of before the West technology gave it a superpower advantage, in the 16th and 17th century, when the Jesuits were sending missionaries to Asia, they were finding the local cultures quite inspiring. Matteo Ricci, in his his translation of the Bible from Latin into Mandarin was an epic work. And the subsequent missions to Macau and elsewhere in China saw a relationship between a Jesuit scholarship and what Ricci called the literati, the Confucian literary scholars, that saw a kind of syncretism. And you could argue that the first China model was based on the Jesuit letters that were sent back to France in the 18th century by Duald, who did 4 volumes of his accounts of going around China, which was sent back, became big, kind of literary successes in 1750s, 60s Paris, the basis of which Voltaire saw China as a more advanced civilization than the West, because, unlike the West or Europe, that had just been through a period of brutal, enthusiastic, religious wars in the 17th century, and had emerged from it with a more tolerant and anti-enthusiastic disposition. For Voltaire, China had acquired a kind of Socrates-like figure in Confucius that didn't need divine revelation and had created a model based on a monarch, a supreme monarch, and this was in a pre-democratic period, and it was the basis, of Voltaire promoting the idea of enlightened despotism to both Joseph II of Austria-Hungary and to Catherine in Russia. And, it became also a model for economic organization with Quenet's theory of land as the basis of wealth, which actually in time, the physiocrats influenced Adam Smith. So this kind of translation of influence, shows just how, as you say, the West was open to ideas from the East, and Eastern ideas like the idea of enlightened despotism, or the idea that land is should be the basis of an economic understanding with Kane, were derived from Chinese,
Or the civil bureaucratic examination.
Exactly, and
that the French took over from the Chinese.
The bureaucratic examination with. First in France, and then it's a British bureaucrat, Meadows, who goes to Hong Kong and looks at China, and he brings back the idea of careers open to talent to the British civil service, from which the term, the civil service Mandarin appears.
David, can I just interrupt you to remind our listeners that you've written an excellent book about this, the image of China in Western social and political thought, which is available online if you do some Google searching.
Right. I think I'll have to do another edition.
You should definitely do that. And I just real quick, I wanted to add that perhaps the most egregious oversight of Saïdian discourse is that it completely ignores Pan-Asianism, which from the late 19th century all through the early 20th century, even in different forms up to the present, is extremely influential throughout East Asia and is centered on an essentialistic, dualistic notion of Western dominance versus Eastern harmony. So West-East discourses, especially in their very essentialistic, dualistic form, have always been co-constructed. The term "the West" is a term that doesn't really appear in political discourse up until the 1890s. So it's really and that's also when Pan-Asianism starts rising. So from the very start, Eastern, so Japanese, Chinese, Korean intellectuals are all over this topic and co-constructing these concepts. It's one of the important things that is overlooked we are actually, ironically, despite all or perhaps because of all the post-colonial literature, as we just discussed, we are overlooking a much more dynamic global picture of intellectual life on Earth. Now, to go to that intellectual legacy as a final point, isn't there a positive and a negative Mao? There's the negative Mao of the repression that represses free speech after the Let 100 Flowers Bloom campaign failed in 1957. There is the Mao that leads a Leninist party state that is enormously repressive and organizes violence in a variety of ways. But there's also the Mao, the idealistic Mao. And this is, of course, there's the idealism of Maoist discourse. It appeals, and there's the idealism in post-colonial discourse. There's the notion of the underdog standing up to power. So isn't that how these strands of thought works? They're intellectual, they're philosophical, they're political, but they also touch humans on a very deep idealistic level, and that they play on the idealism, and that the Cultural Revolution touched young people in France who were not inspired anymore by this hard Stalinist form of Soviet communism. The fact that the Maoism could touch their heart in a softer place, so to speak, that Maoism played on their lofty ideals of equality and on their dreams. This is how Maoism was powerful in the West. Right?
Well, I don't know whether it's idealistic so much as it's romantic. What's so powerful about this kind of thinking? The students in France knew very little, next to nothing, about China in 67, 68, but they were bored. Russian Soviet Marxism seemed not something to follow. It was as brutal, in its treatment of Hungarians in 56, and in 68 there was the Czech attempt at liberation, and that was brutally put down. So Moscow was not an attractive option for a young idealist circa 67, 68, nor was America, which was always spelt with a Kafkaesque K in it, because of the Vietnam War, So the two Western alternatives, if you like, the Soviet model and the American liberal model, the Cold War polarities, both of them had no appeal to rather a generation that had come out of the war, which was probably the wealthiest and kind of educated young middle class that was emerging, and they had. They've had a great, the lifestyle was good. These were the 40 years of the golden age in French development, from about 1950 to 1970. So they were just bored, really, and they were looking for new sources of, interest, whether it was rock and roll, sex and drugs, or, the East, So the East became a 60s romantic ideal, It was, the Beatles went to India, Jean-Paul Sartre went to Beijing,
Gauche proletarian and Telquel.
The whole lot. So there was this whole, coming out of 67, 60, and it was particularly, initially inspired by Ho Chi Minh, obviously, because of the Vietnam War. But Ho Chi Minh's bigger backer was seen to be China, although it wasn't. But China itself, suddenly became, this cultural revolution coinciding with the boredom of 1960s, Britain, America, and France and Germany.
Coinciding with decolonization.
So,
Algerian situation in France.
Yeah, that's right. But it's also this sense that we're living in a very dull world. That the animators of it's a new Orientalism. In the sense of that we're looking to the Orient for inspiration, and Mao appears at the right moment. The Cultural Revolution. Our culture's really dead. The only thing that's happening really for the young is, of course, the counterculture. And the counterculture looks to Mao, as it looks to India, as a source of inspiration, together with lysergic acid dithalamide. So that Mao is part of an environment where, for the more radical student left, his understanding is far more graspable, far more direct than having to listen to the, endless expositions of the weakness of Western culture in Adorno or Marcuse or Horkheimer or Lukács, who, are still, they criticize Western culture, and then it's a cultural form of Marxism that they're promoting. But people like Adorno or Marcuse go into inordinate, lengthy theses, exploring the context of Western thought, its dialectic, the failures of Western, not high culture, which, someone like Adorno or Horkheimer hugely admire. They're not anti-Shakespeare, nor was Marx, for that matter, who endlessly quotes Shakespeare. They hated Western popular culture. Adorno hated Hollywood. But so although they were culturally critical, they didn't hate the whole of Western culture. When Mao comes in with his little red book, which is just a set of aphorisms that you have to learn, and which are often great, the silver-plated bullets of the bourgeoisie, the capitalist tigers, the revolutionary road, the Wenhua Da Ge Ming. It all makes great sort of slogans, and that kind of sloganistic thinking really appeals to people with artistic imaginations, like Jean-Luc Godard, who does 2 movies on Maoism, Les Chinois, and becomes invests in the whole idea of the gauche proletarienne. That there's
a much overrated director, in my opinion. I'm a huge fan of mid-century French cinema, but I've always thought the Godard.
Well,
was
Les
overrated.
Mépris is a good film.
But can I just ask you? I think we need to begin to draw this to a close. But as I was reading the book and thinking about this, it seems that neither of these elements independently cannot be found many other places. But I'm curious whether the union of these 2 themes in Maoism strikes you as part of the real Maoist legacy in Europe. So it seems to me that connecting hostility to the past and hostility to the West.
Yeah, and also the characteristic of Maoism that when the Tel-Quel group like Kristeva and Soler go to China, or when someone like the Cambridge economist Joan Robinson goes to is invited to teach to talk to the Red Guards, she finds their enthusiasm, their passion so important. And it's that idea that the Chinese exude this commitment, enthusiasm. It's a kind of it's a passion. So what's essential about this Maoism is not its intellectual appeal. It works on a level of the emotions. The emotions are central to the Maoist understanding of revolution, really, and permanent revolution. The anxiety and fear you'll feel in the struggle group, but the mobilization of passions against the hated other. So it's protest and rage rather than any kind of intellectual analysis that permeates the Maoist model. There's an analysis. There's the elite party line that must be followed, but in order to follow it, the masses must be mobilized not by reason but by passion, by protest.
I think we're just going to leave that enormous elephant in the room that is the contemporary events in France. We're just gonna leave that elephant, right?
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.